Hello and welcome back to my small little library. Let's talk about ghost stories. This is a topic that I've kind of getting into right now, and yeah, I just started reading a little bit more ghost stories, and I think I'm just really loving the genre, and I'm getting more and more into it. And so I thought, why not look a little bit into the history of ghost stories and talk with you about it. Um, yeah, just like let's get a little bit of an education together. Let's look into where they're coming from, why they maybe exist at all, and what is so fascinating about ghosts that keeps us writing stories. So for me, ghost stories always were kind of like a mix between the horror genre and the fantasy genre, because obviously there are typical things of both in ghost stories together. And so I typically don't seek terror in ghost stories, but I also want like a lot of mystery and like this underlying horror that isn't really like really stark and like really prominent, but that is there in everything that happens in the story. And so I started to look a little bit more into where ghost stories are coming from, because for me personally, I think the horror stories I know the most are those that are coming out of England and Britain, primarily because that are the authors I've read most of. Um, and so I thought, okay, let's have a look at where they actually originate. And interestingly enough, the first ghost stories that we know about today are the ones from ancient Rome, which I think kind of tells you a lot about how long ago people started thinking about ghosts and kind of like the terror that ghosts can do. And I actually studied Latin in high school and while at university a little bit. And sad to say, we never read a ghost story. But let me tell you, the first ever documented ghost story that we know of today is Mastellaria by Plautus. And he was a Roman playwright, and his story was primarily about a haunted dwelling. So it's kind of the first haunted house story, if you take it literally, which I think is kind of cool that they go back to the Romans. And so, yeah, that is the first one. The second one is a ghost story by Pliny the Younger, who lived roughly around 50 AD, so a little bit after Plautus, but there isn't really much information about the story. I think you would kind of have to be a historian to look more into that. But yeah, we're starting with the Romans, which is kind of cool. And then Seneca also had a lot of mentions of ghosts in his work. I think Seneca is someone you might know, because he is a little bit more prominent when it comes to like Roman history. But yeah, he seems to have a lot of mentions when it comes to ghost stories. Then, obviously, the Arabic literature isn't far behind, and we have a book that we still know today that is called the Encyclopedia of the Brethren of Purity. And that seems to be a ghost story. I have to be honest, I haven't read much Arabic literature. Um, Obviously, I don't speak the language, but other than that, also, I haven't read a lot of translations. Not because I don't want to, it's just something that don't get but you don't see them often here in Germany, at least not when I'm looking, and I'm also not one for like fairy tales and stuff. And I think for me personally, Arabic literature is leans more into like fairy tale stuff, which I don't think is that interesting in my opinion. So yeah, I was pleasantly surprised to see that there is a ghost story out there, which I definitely want to look into, because I think that it would probably read a lot different than like British or even Roman ghost stories. So yeah, that is definitely something I want to look into. Then the next one we have mention of is the Tale of Genji, which is an 11th century Japanese ghost story. Obviously, I think ghost stories in Japanese culture are a lot more prevalent. You probably know a lot more about that. Even a lot of them got made into video games, which is where I know a lot of from, because like ghosts are kind of really prominent in Japanese culture when it comes to like horror tales, and they'd had a lot of those. And yeah, the first one in Japan seems to be the Tale of Genji, which would be really interesting to look into as well. Then we have kind of a little bit of a time jump. We're in the 16th century now, and actually at that time people kind of rediscovered Seneca's stories and morphed those into tragedies. A lot of like Shakespearean tragedies and stuff like that are inspired by Seneca's ghost stories. I personally haven't read or seen a lot of Shakespeare. It's not something I'm personally interested in, but I don't think they seem to feature ghosts, but there aren't particularly like ghost stories, like the main focus isn't on the ghost. So yeah, they were definitely inspired by Seneca and his stuff, but they kind of made different stories out of them that are more like tragedies and less like ghost stories. But they did pick up kind of like those topics. Before the 18th century, ghosts were often depicted in armor, especially like shortly before that, because if you bring a ghost story onto like a theater stage, you kind of need to like show the thing. You can't just like let air be there. And so even though we have like a lot of like non-corporeal ghosts, armored ghosts were kind of like in fashion before that, and then after the 18th century, to make it a little bit easier for the stage, we have sheeted ghosts, which is what we all grew up with. I mean, if you go on Halloween, if you go as a ghost, you obviously take a sheet, put it over you, cut some eye holes, and you're a ghost. So yeah, that seems to stem from the 18th century, primarily because it was easier to show on stage, which also like then is seen in the literature, which I think is also kind of cool. That kind of like theater has a lot of influence, obviously, also on the literature, because you want to be able to show the story on stage. And yeah, ghosts were also a big part. In the 16th and 17th century, we have something that had a really, really big influence on ghost stories, and that was ballads from England. Those were a lot about ghosts, which kind of cool. I'm not a historian. I won't go into like specific ballads like this. Just a rough overview, because yeah, I mean I could do more of a deep dive in there if there's maybe some interest there, because I think it's an interesting story. But yeah, for today we will keep it rather rough. So yeah, they had a lot of ballads, and ghosts featured very, very prominently there. Up until then, pretty much all of the ghost stories weren't in like book or novel form, but more in like stage plays, theater plays, and yeah, obviously the things Seneca wrote down, but they weren't books per se. So yeah. So the official first ghost story, as far as I could find out, is not only a ghost story, but also the first Gothic novel, as per the internet. And that is called The Castle of Otranto. Otranto? I have no idea how you pronounce that. But yeah, that is in 1764 officially the first ghost novel that we have preserved today. I mean, we don't know. Maybe there were other ones out there, but that is the one we know about. And that is typically coined the first ghost and Gothic novel, because it was both in one, which is kind of cool. Gothic novels, obviously, not all are about ghosts. They had a lot of different other topics. But yeah, the first one seemed to be about a ghost, and it features a castle, you know. With the beginning of ghost novels, we can also see there is something that like kind of goes through all of them, that they are mostly set in the time of the reader. So obviously nowadays we still read a lot of older ghost stories, but they were always set in the time where the writer lived. In a lot of different genres, you have like sci-fi. They often are depicting the future that hasn't happened yet, but ghost stories tend to stay in the same time they were written in, to make them just that much more realistic, because obviously believing a ghost story that happened hundreds of years ago is way harder than believing a ghost story that could happen to you any day now. So yeah, that seems to be a theme that goes through all of them, and that started with the first ghost story in 1764. Kind of a thing why the 18th century is like an important part in the history of ghost stories is that the 18th century was kind of the time for spiritualism. Obviously, it was a time where people died young and often and due to different circumstances, and the people obviously needed a way to cope with that because death isn't easy and losing your loved ones, definitely is a hard thing. And so there were a lot of people who were mediums. I have to say here, I'm very skeptical about that stuff. I don't believe in that. But I think it's important to mention because obviously seances and all of that stuff, having a medium who talks, which you can talk to a loved one that is dead, pretty much to the ghost of the loved one, obviously was like a big thing back then. And everyone who could spend the money would actually go and talk to loved ones who had already died. And so that obviously also brought ghost novels to like a forefront of literature, because it was just a really popular topic, and obviously a lot of topics that are current you can see in books that isn't any different nowadays. And so yeah, we actually see a lot of ghost stories in the 18th century because people were just a lot more spiritualist in the West. Obviously I'm speaking for like England and Germany and Europe and stuff like that. I can't speak here for like India or Africa or stuff like that. That is kind of like not in this video, to be honest. I didn't find a lot out about that. I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of ghost stories in like especially African culture or even Australians, the indigenous Australian people. They were really spiritual people in general. So I think there are probably a lot of ghost stories there. So yeah, in the 18th century, the West was really, really spiritualist and interested in ghost stories, and they wanted to see the ghost of loved ones. And typically ghost stories in that kind of time also weren't like really brutal stories or really like terrorizing stories. A lot of them were just like kind of sentimental stories, if you look at it that way, because obviously people connected a lot of good feelings to talking to ghosts and stuff like that. And so yeah, you have the stories where like the ghosts are evil, but you also have a lot of stories where the ghosts are nice people and try to help people get through life after dying and stuff like that, so yeah, even though in this day and age we typically connect ghost stories to like horror stories, that wasn't always. Coming to the early 19th century, we actually have the first ghost short stories, and those actually originated in Germany, which I found kind of interesting. I have to be honest, I don't think I've ever read a German ghost story, which is kind of sad. I really have to look into that, but I don't know a lot about early 19th century German literature. It's not something we read in school. We read literature that's a little bit younger. But yeah, so I will definitely look into that. But the first one that is documented is The Beggar Woman of Locarno, and that is by Kleist, who was a German author, and that is the first documented short story about ghosts. And yeah, obviously, as I said already, spiritualism was high at that point. Between 1830 and the First World War, ghost stories were just really like had their golden age and their prime time. And so yeah, we have a lot of stories from that age. And a lot of the classic ghost story authors were M.R. James, Sheridan Le Fond, Mrs. J.H. Riddle, Violet Hunt, and Henry James, for example. Also, Henry James kind of coined the Jamesian style of ghost stories, which is kind of like a subtype of ghost story. And we actually have like two kind of like styles of ghost stories, and the Jamesian style is like set in an English village or seaside town in the country, or preferably in France, Denmark, or Sweden. if you can get it, an abbot or university is standing there at some point. And yeah, the main character is mostly a nondescript or a very naive gentleman scholar, so he has kind of an education, but he's still very naive at the same time. And a lot of the times, the ghost hunting start because of an old book or just an antiquarian object, and that is kind of the Jamesian style of ghost stories, and they can be brutal. They can be really, really scary. He doesn't mind that, but yeah, that was kind of his style, and there are a lot of authors who wrote under that style. And then we have the second kind of ghost stories, which are more like the classical British ghost stories, and they have a few kind of like terms that are important, and that is a pretense of truth, then a pleasing terror, no gratuitous bloodshed or sex, which obviously is kind of in contrast to the Jamesian style. Then we have no explanation of the machinery, and that the ghost story has to be set in the time of the reader or the writer, you know, at the time when the book comes out. So yeah, that is pretty much like the classical thing. There actually wasn't a lot of bloodshed or sex in those novels. That wasn't something that was used to create more terror, and that is something that, in my opinion, I really enjoy. I don't need blood, I don't need horrible things happening for ghost story to be a good ghost story. And yeah, that is actually in the 19th century the prominent style of ghost story, and that also like goes into the classic style of ghost stories. And then in the 19th century, also ghost stories went on to America. American authors were really inspired by the British and German ghost stories. And so yeah, one story that came out of that, which is actually inspired by a German tale of the Headless Horseman, is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. A favorite of mine. Big fan of the movie, if you've watched it. But yeah, that was actually inspired by a German tale of the Headless Horseman. And yeah, that is one really prominent American tale, obviously. Then Henry James is from America, so the Jamesian style is kind of like the American style of ghost stories, which kind of seem to be a little bit more brutal than the English ones. And Edgar Allan Poe, obviously, he also wrote a few ghost stories, and those are really popular as well, because he in general is like a popular author. And then we have the modern era, which is kind of like everything after like 1930 onwards. And here we have, for example, Shirley Jackson with The Haunting of Hill House, one I actually really, really like. And another pretty big author seems to be Fritz Leiber. I have heard nothing of him or read nothing of him now, but yeah, he seems to be a popular ghost story author. And that is actually where the history part of this video ends. Just like a little bit of an overview, although I think it's kind of important because of the books I want to talk about in this video. Because one thing that really seemed to be a hot topic in like the comment sections in Goodreads, for example, for like ratings and stuff, was that a lot of the ghost stories I've read personally aren't really that scary or aren't like in any way violent, you know, just like too mellow for a lot of people. And I think if you look at the history of ghost stories, we can see that there's actually a reason to that, and that they actually wanted the stories to be more subtle and not so in your face horror. And I think that a lot of people tend to think of ghost stories as being purely horror stories, but I think they are more like tragedies, as they were used in like the 16th century, you know. I think a lot of them are more like melodramatic and really like living more off of the atmosphere that it could happen to you every day now, and instead of being something that is really like far away that you can't really grasp. So I think that is something that you need to keep in mind. Obviously, nobody has to love ghost stories, and if you want more brutal stories, do that. I think there are a lot of them out there. You will probably find one that you really, really like. But yeah, I think you always have to kind of keep that in the back of your mind, that it kind of was with like a purpose that ghost stories aren't really that brutal. If you compare to like horror movies, for example, the what are they called? The movies with Ed and Lorraine, where you have them going into houses that are haunted. Those are, for example, really brutal kind of ghost stories, and I would say they are ghost stories because there are apparitions and stuff in there. But yeah, films tend to be a lot more brutal when it comes to that, and I think books tend to be a little bit more mellow when it comes to that. And now let's talk about the ghost stories I have already read. And yeah, maybe you can leave a comment below what kind of ghost stories you think I should definitely pick up next. Let's start at the top. This is one I actually didn't like. It's called Ghost House by Claire McNally. This one is not that old, I think, but it was originally published in 1979. So it is older, it is not modern, but it's not old, you know. And yeah, this is a ghost house story that I think brought nothing new to the table, and there were like the atmosphere wasn't here, which is why I think this one didn't make a good story, because for me the most important aspect of a ghost story is the atmosphere. And if that is missing and I feel like it's all weird, that doesn't help. Also, this has really unnecessary sexual stuff in there. I seemingly am more of like a traditional ghost story kind of person, and so I didn't like that at all, and I thought it really unnecessary, and that is the reason why I don't think it needed to be in there. And yeah, so I didn't like that one. Next up, we have an author that also wrote a lot of ghost stories, and that is Susan Hill. We have The Woman in Black, The Small Hand, and The Man in the Picture. All three of them I read, I liked them, though these two are by far my favorite. This one I thought was a lot kind of like weaker compared to those two, but these all live off of their atmosphere, which is why this one is weaker, because the atmosphere is kind of a little bit weaker, and we have a lot of repetition in this one. But these two I think are great examples for like going back to the classics and making like a really, really, really good atmosphere and thinking it could happen to you at any time. These play in relative modern times. We have people here who drive a car, so it's kind of like not as modern as now, but you know, a really modern setting. And so you really feel like, wait, that could happen to me. I could drive down like a deserted road and a child could jump out in front of me, in front of the car, and just be gone once I stop, you know? So stuff like that. For this, these two are really, really, really cool. I think I gave them both 4 stars. For me, Susan Hill definitely has a good place in ghost stories. But yeah, these aren't brutal, these aren't that scary. They're more really sad, kind of dramatic, atmospheric stories, which is why I love them. Then continuing on, obviously I read The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I think this is a really great haunted house story. The atmosphere is just really, really good. That's why I love those stories. I think she does it really great with like the apparitions and stuff, creaking doors, opening doors, having a feeling of not being able to leave the house, you know, all that kind of stuff that isn't technically directly scary, but it kind of like has this underlying fear that you're feeling. Really, really good done here. I like it. I think it's one of the best haunted house stories, in my opinion. But obviously, I might try to find a lot of the older ghost stories, because maybe the original ones did it the best. Who knows? But yeah. Then we have one that is really, really modern, which is Neil Gaiman, The Graveyard Boy. Here, this is one example for like positive ghosts, because here we have a young boy who grows up on a graveyard, and the ghosts kind of tend to him and try to be good family for him. So this is, for me, kind of like a good example of the original ghost stories that were more like trying to, well, not the original ones, yeah, but you know, the ones in the 18th century who didn't see ghosts as necessarily evil beings. So yeah, this is just an example for positive ghost story. Then, yeah, I read The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. I liked it, but for me this one was lacking the atmosphere that I personally prefer. This one worked a lot more with like scaring you actually, or trying to scare you actually, and for me it kind of missed the point a little bit on a ghost story. Also, I found this to be way too short, which was a problem I didn't have with the other ones, because yeah, this one is definitely really short, 140 pages. So yeah, for me this was just a little bit lacking, but I could see where like the inspiration was from, and obviously in more modern books I could see that they kind of like also read this and got their inspiration from it and kind of did it in a good way. So yeah, I think this, even though I didn't love it, I think this is a good cornerstone for ghost stories. So yeah, I do have a copy of Edgar Allan Poe's stories. I read just a little bit of those. I haven't gotten through all of his ghost stories, though I do think his are obviously a lot older than the ones I've read here. And so they are a little bit they're still a little bit more like harder to understand for me, because obviously they are a lot less set in my time, and I do think that the ghost story authors really had a point in setting that like ground rule of having a ghost story set in your own time, because you kind of do resonate with those a lot more. Yeah, I mean, obviously seeing a ghost while riding in like a horse carriage isn't that scary, because let's be honest, I don't ride horse carriages anymore. So yeah, I think that is really, really valid point. And yeah, as you can see, I haven't read that many ghost stories yet. I probably missed some that I picked up as ebooks, but these are the ones I physically own, so I can physically talk about them and have them in front of me. But yeah, I think ghost stories is like a really interesting genre. I personally have these under my horror books, because I do think that they tend to be more scary, even though it isn't like really like a brutal scare or stuff like that. And I personally really do prefer less scary ghost stories that have a lot more like mystery, not knowing what is happening, leaving you in the dark and leaving you to that fear of the unknown. That is something I personally really love in ghost stories. And yeah, so I do want to read a lot more of them. I haven't come across a lot of these. I think they aren't like that popular anymore, so you don't get like a lot of new ones. But yeah, I have definitely some authors, some older authors that I want to look into. I do want to continue with Susan Hill's stories, because I think her ghost stories are really my taste. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say about ghost stories. I might do a follow-up once I've read quite a bit more ghost stories to like update you on what I think are the best ghost stories. Like, none of these have ever gotten 5 stars. I don't think I found the perfect ghost story for me personally yet. But yeah, I'm definitely on the search for more, and yeah, it's a genre I really do enjoy, and I also think it's like one of those genres where you like just want to cuddle up and get the book out and just read it in one sitting, because it's so like gripping. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and maybe leave me a like or comment. Have you any inspiration what I should go after when it comes to ghost stories? Have you read these or some other ones I definitely should try? Leave it down below. And yeah, it would mean really a lot to me if you would subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.